Thank you. Good morning. If you don't mind, please remain standing with me while I read to you from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 8, verses 27 to 38. Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi, and on the way, he asked his disciples, "Who do you say that I am?" And they answered him, "John the Baptist, and others Elijah, and still others one of the prophets." He asked them, "But who do you say that I am?" Peter answered him, "You are the Messiah." And he sternly ordered them not to tell anyone about him. Then he began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He said all this quite openly, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." He called the crowd with his disciples and said to them, "If any wish to come after me, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Indeed, what can they give in return for their life? Those who are ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of them the Son of Man will also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels." This is a portion of the story of God told for the people of God. Thanks be to God. Please have a seat. And as you take a seat, I'm going to invite you to do exactly what I did as I read the lectionary text for the first time after telling Reed that I would preach today. And that's take a big, deep, cleansing breath. There we go. Thank you. Thank you. Parts of this passage are going to be very familiar to you if you have been around the church for a while. Some of this has even leaked into just our common vernacular with phrases like, "It's my cross to bear," right? So it may even be familiar to you if you're not as familiar with this specific passage. But it's complex. And on the surface, it doesn't make us feel all warm and fuzzy inside. And so I want to let you know that it's okay if it makes you a little uncomfortable. It made me a little uncomfortable. And it's okay. We are not going to solve it all in the next 20 minutes. So I invite you to join me as we wrestle with this a little bit. And just know that if at the end there are more questions than answers, I've probably done an okay job with this. All right. As Chris described, I am a religious educator, a theologian, and I am married to a physician assistant. And when a religious educator and a theologian and a physician assistant get married, what do you get? Books. You get a lot of books. We have a lot of books in our house. And then they have 2 kids, and so then what do you get? Children's books. That's right, lots of children's books, and we love to read. And one of our favorite books that we read often in our house right now is a book titled The Bear Ate Your Sandwich. And it was written by Julia Sarcone Roach, and I'm about to spoil it, so if you need to cover your ears, that's okay. But the book opens with the line, "By now, I think you know what happened to your sandwich." It's in the title, right? And then it proceeds to tell the story of a bear who has taken an accidental journey from the forest into the city. And as this bear journeys into the city, he experiences all new sights and sounds and smells and feelings. And then in a stroke of luck, the bear in a park on a bench eyes a beautiful and delicious sandwich. And as that bear is helping himself to the sandwich, he is caught in the act by a pack of dogs. And startled, he runs off back out of the city, catches a boat off into the forest, and we are reassured, don't worry, the bear's doing fine, right? But the plot twist comes in the last couple of pages when we turn the page and we hear, I'm really sorry to have to tell you about your sandwich this way. I really tried to stop him. All I could save was this piece of lettuce. And we realize that the story is being told by a dog. And if you have a dog, you know that the dog ate the sandwich, right? You spend this whole time thinking that the bear ate the sandwich, and at the end you begin to understand that you weren't as sure about the identity as you thought. So to gain some context for today's passage, we'll come back to that, let's take a quick look at what has taken place so far in the Gospel of Mark. So unlike the other Gospels that spend a considerable amount of time on Jesus' birth, the Gospel of Mark kind of goes right to business. Jesus shows up, he comes on the scene, and he is baptized. And we hear, as a reader, a voice from heaven declare him to be the Son of God. So right away, we're getting an idea of who this Jesus is. And then he is whisked away to the desert where he is tempted by Satan. And so we immediately understand that as the Son of God, he is in opposition to Satan. So then he returns, he calls his disciples, and immediately gets to work. And the gospel writer spends the next 7.5 chapters describing how Jesus preaches the kingdom of God through parables, a kingdom that we come to understand looks nothing like the kingdoms that we know, that were familiar to Mark's reader, and even the kingdoms that are familiar to us today. He teaches with authority, he heals the infirmed, he feeds the hungry, and he exorcises the demonic. Again and again, in village after village, Jesus demonstrates his power by helping the powerless. So when we see Jesus begin a conversation with his disciples about his identity, you can almost imagine the gospel writer saying, "By now, I think you know who Jesus is." Actually, one of the points of tension in the Gospel of Mark is the fact that we, the reader, and probably Mark's original audience, have information that is still unclear to the religious and political authorities, the general population, and even Jesus' own family and disciples in the story. So in response, the disciples recall some of what we've already heard, that others are speculating that Jesus is Elijah or that he's another great prophet returning. This would have been expected by the Jews. At the time, they were waiting for Elijah or a great prophet that would come, and that would be a sign of the beginning of the end times. Herod, who had John the Baptist killed earlier in the story, even speculates that Jesus could be John the Baptist raised from the dead. And so while the speculation that Jesus is a great prophet or John the Baptist portrays a very high view of him, we as the reader immediately understand that this is not an adequate depiction of who he is. And then as Jesus turns the question to his disciples, "Who do you say that I am?" we feel the mood shift, and we sense maybe a bit of a challenge for the disciples to dig a little bit deeper as they answer the question. So when we read Peter's response, "You are the Messiah," we think, wow, they're finally starting to catch on. They got it. We're like, yes, that is the right answer. But Jesus doesn't confirm this claim. He also doesn't dispute it. And then he shifts directly into teaching about discipleship. And it's important, I think, that we don't miss this. For Jesus, his identity and our work as his followers are inextricably bound. Lordship and discipleship go hand in hand. Who we understand Jesus to be, how we understand him to have lived, will determine how we live as his disciples in this world. So Jesus describes himself as the Son of Man, which would have been understood as a declaration of his humanity, and makes what will be the first of 3 predictions, 3 passion predictions. So predictions about his suffering, his crucifixion, and his resurrection that is to come. Peter immediately steps up to let Jesus know that if he's the Messiah, this is not the right way, right? It says that Peter rebukes Jesus. And so he's saying, hey, Jesus, if you're the Messiah, you're going about it all wrong. And this is where we get the stinging rebuke that makes me a little uncomfortable as the reader. When Jesus turns to Peter and says, "Get behind me, Satan," feels like a little intense. Like maybe we can sympathize a little bit with the disciples and their lack of understanding. And then we hear Jesus call him Satan, and we're like, whoa, that's a lot. So Jesus has just redefined, as he's gone about his teaching, he has redefined their understanding of what kingdom means, of what it means to build the kingdom of God. And now, in his teaching, he has redefined for them what it means to be Messiah. Not just to be divine, but to also be human and to suffer rejection and death. By rebuking Jesus' teaching, Peter has revealed his own ideas of what it means to be the Messiah. Peter's expectations that the Messiah would never suffer the humiliation and shame of death on the cross likely reflects broader Jewish cultural expectations at the time. Expectations of someone who would come, swords blazing, to dismantle the oppressive empire through divine military and political might and restore Israel to its former glory. By rejecting Jesus' definition of Messiah and inserting his own, Peter has unknowingly placed himself in front of Jesus as the opposition. Just as Jesus was tempted by Satan in the wilderness to choose earthly comfort and power, he is now being pushed by Peter to choose a path counter to the very kingdom he proclaims. So we follow this uncomfortable exchange, and Jesus begins to address the broader audience, saying, "If any of you wish to come after me, take up your cross and follow me. For those who want to save their lives will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake, for the sake of the gospel, will save it." In these conflicting views of the Messiah, Mark has laid out two distinct paths of discipleship. So let us revisit the statement that lordship and discipleship are inextricably bound. What does discipleship look like if we follow a Lord who uses military and political power for his own gain, destroying anyone who stands in opposition? What does discipleship look like if we follow a Lord who uses his power as a religious leader for fear, shame, and control? But what if we follow a Lord who uses his power as the Son of God to feed hungry bodies, deliver captive souls, heal sickness, and uplift the oppressed? What if we follow a Lord who does all of this willingly, knowing that it places him in direct conflict with the warped justice, religious corruption, and staunch oppression being enacted by the religious and political leaders of the day? What does that lead us to as his disciples? The phrase, "take up your cross," as I mentioned earlier, is likely familiar to you as it has become commonplace in our Christian culture. We use the term, "it's just my cross to bear," often to describe minor inconveniences. We live in South Texas and the air conditioning is out. It's just my cross to bear. Even worse, we can let this phrase and this thinking justify our inaction toward the suffering of others. It's just their cross to bear. For Mark's earliest audience, the cross was a very real and present reality. Many of those who chose to follow Jesus, to join this early Christian movement, would find themselves suffering the same humiliating and shameful death on a cross. So where does this leave us today when crucifixion on a cross seems so far off, so foreign? I certainly do not think that we can view the whole of Jesus' work and his teaching on earth and interpret this as Jesus or the gospel writer prescribing individual suffering as a path to sanctification. I think it is much more appropriate to understand the call to take up our cross as a call to follow Jesus in choosing to identify more with the oppressed and suffering than the powerful and mighty. To follow him in the path of healing, feeding, clothing, and freeing that ultimately led him to the cross. A call not about seeking suffering as an end unto itself, but giving our whole selves to this work of confronting the suffering of our neighbors whenever we encounter it, regardless of the sacrifice. So for me, as I've wrestled with this uncomfortable text, it's led me to ask some pretty tough questions of myself and of the American church today. Questions like, who do we say that Jesus is when our neighbors do not have food to eat or clothes to wear? Who do we say that Jesus is when men, women, and children do not have a safe place to lay their heads at night due to lack of shelter, violence, and war? Who do we say that Jesus is when religious leaders use his name to manipulate and shame and tear down? Who do we say that Jesus is when political leaders incite us toward hate and division instead of love and reconciliation? In a world that continually tempts us to dehumanize, Jesus asks us to follow his path as a human, even if it means sacrifice, to see and meet other human beings in their suffering, to lift them from their oppression, and to invite them on the path to life through love. When I was in middle and high school, I remember getting my first algebra textbook and being pleased to find that all of the answers to the problems were in the back of the textbook. You can imagine, of course, my dismay when the teacher explained that having the right answers was only the beginning. In order to pass the course, we would have to demonstrate our ability to work through the problems correctly and arrive at the appropriate answer. Just like Mark might have said, by now, I think you know who Jesus is. Modern Christians have endless libraries of writing, centuries of church history, and sacred tradition that give us beautiful words to use to describe Jesus, who he was and what he did in his life, death, and resurrection. But just like my algebra book, I think we have the right words to say, having the right words to say, the right answers to give is only the beginning. We must take a careful look at the way we understand Jesus and our path as his followers, to think critically about the words that we use and the actions that we take, and to recognize when they place us directly in opposition to the kingdom of God that Jesus proclaimed so boldly.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Weekly Teaching. To watch the full live stream of this worship service, you can view all archived streams at the Alamo Heights UMC YouTube channel. If you have any questions, email us at podcasts@ahumc.org. That's podcasts@ahumc.org. You can also visit our website, ahumc.org, anytime. Any related links are also in this episode's show notes. Again, thank you so much for being a listener. We truly appreciate your time.